There's this crazy story at the beginning of the Bible. We have Adam and Eve, and they're in the Garden of Eden.
And everything in this garden is great. It's exactly as it should be, except there's this one tree that they're told by God not to eat from because it's dangerous and it will kill them.
So that's it. Avoid this fruit tree and we're fine.
Right, it seems pretty simple. But in this garden, there's a snake, and it starts telling a different story. It says that if you eat of this tree, it's not going to kill you. In fact, it's going to make you become like God.
And Adam and Eve, they believe the snake and they eat the fruit.
And because of this, the goodness of the garden is tragically lost, and evil and death enters into God's good world.
Now, why is there a talking snake in the garden? I mean, this thing is a problem.
Yeah, it's very strange. And even more strange is the fact that the Bible doesn't say why or how this thing even got there. It just presents the snake as this creature who's in rebellion against God and that wants to get other people to doubt God's goodness and lead them on a path towards death. And so whatever this snake is, it's the source of evil that pervades our world and our lives, even still today.
But there is some hope, because right here in the story, God makes this really interesting promise to Adam and Eve.
That someone is going to come in the future, a son of Eve. And this guy's going to come and he's going to crush the serpent's head and destroy evil at its source. However, during this battle, the serpent is going to bite this guy's heel.
So it's like a mutual destruction.
Yeah, it's this very strange but beautiful promise, and it's just left hanging there until the next key moment in the story.
Welcome to another episode of Ring Them Bells. The focus of this channel and the Bible is Jesus. Now, some call Jesus, Jesus Christ. What does Christ mean? Is it a title for Jesus? Is it Jesus' last name? The meaning behind the word Christ gives us the backdrop for the entire biblical narrative. As we begin to understand this word Christ, we'll see that it's directly associated with the Jewish word Messiah. And this word Messiah, contained within the Hebrew scriptures, traces back all the way to the Garden of Eden, where we find the first promise of the snake crusher. This two-part series will not only help you understand the word Messiah, but also the meaning of the entire Bible and your purpose inside all of this. The Bible Project has taught us that the Bible is a unified story that leads to Jesus. One of the ways that the Bible is unified is understanding the Bible through this promise of the snake crusher and the ultimate promise of the Messiah. I want to take a quick second to ask you to subscribe. This channel's growing rapidly, and the reach and scope that God's giving this channel is blowing my mind. But every subscription, every like, every share helps us get the good news out about what Jesus has done for this world. So let's get straight to it.
What do we mean that the Bible is messianic literature?
Yes. We spent the last few episodes talking about what we mean when we say the Bible is unified.
Right.
It's a collection of diverse literature, but that is unified. And one of the ways that we said it's unified, that we spelled out a little bit in the last two podcast episodes, was that there's a governing story that unifies it, that's being told from beginning to end. Not always in a straightforward linear way. Sometimes the story will pause and double back and recover parts of it, or go back and focus in on certain things. Because the first words of Genesis are in the beginning.
Mm-hmm.
And then in the second to last paragraph of the Revelation, the narrative ends but saying, and they reigned forever and ever, referring back to the image of God on page 1, which is God blessed them and appointed them to reign. Let them reign.
Yeah.
So there's a governing story, and that governing story is what we're referring to in this point. We're just going to focus in on the unified storyline of the Bible, which is what we're calling messianic.
The story is messianic.
It's a story about the Messiah.
Okay. That's what the story's about. The story's about a lot of things, right?
But what is it mainly about?
What is it mainly about?
Yeah. Here it just raises the bigger question of what is the Bible about, which will give us really significant guiding lines as to what it's for and what you do with it. So what we're saying here is that what it is a unified story that you could say is about the Messiah. But that itself forces you to ask, like, what does that mean? So one way to think about it is, if I'm a follower of Jesus, or I could use the word Christian, which is a English word
To be a Christ follower.
spelling a Greek word that is the Greek word for Messiah.
Oh, that's right.
The word Christ is the Greek translation of the Hebrew word Mashiach, which is the word Messiah. So even if I'm a Christian, it means I'm a Messiah person.
Messiah person.
And why would I care about the Hebrew scriptures? Well, they were of huge significance and importance to the person I think is the Messiah, and that is Jesus of Nazareth. So here's a story about Jesus from the end of the Gospel of Luke, Luke chapter 24. It's one of these stories where Jesus appears surprisingly to his followers after he's risen from the dead. And they're freaked out. They think he's a ghost at first. And then he's like, hey, do you have any fish? I'm so hungry. So hungry right now.
Just, it took it out of me.
Just to raise from the
Dying
dead.
and rising from the dead.
So hungry.
I just need a snack.
So what he says to the people in the room, and he says, this is Luke 24:44. These are the words that I was speaking to you while I was still with you. All the things written about me in the Torah of Moses, in the prophets, and in the Psalms. Notice he's got a 3-part shape to the scriptures on his mind. All of that was written about me in the Tanakh, Torah, the prophets, writings, had to be fulfilled, had to come to its fullness. It's as if Jesus reads the Hebrew scriptures as something that forms like an empty container. It's a story that creates an emptiness that must be filled full.
That's a cool image.
It is. The Torah and the prophets had to be filled full. And what he says is, it's about me. That's what he just said. All the things written about me in the Torah, prophets,
and that's similar to what he says on in the Sermon on the Mount, right? Where he says, because people were worried, like, hey, are you teaching something beyond the Torah and the prophets, or are you dismissing the Torah and the prophets? And he's like, no, I've come to fill them full.
That's right. It's the same word.
Okay.
Yeah, plerao. Yeah, to fill up. So what happens in this story, after he says that, Luke tells us that then he opened their minds to understand the scriptures. And he said to them, this is what's written. So this is so great because it's in one sentence. It's a long one, a long sentence, but it's in one sentence, Jesus' summary of what the Hebrew Bible is about. And here's what he says. This is what is written, that the Messiah would suffer, would rise again from the dead on the 3rd day, and that repentance for forgiveness of sins would be proclaimed in his name to all the nations, beginning from Jerusalem. Connected with what he said earlier, it's about me. And then here he says it's about the Messiah. So, yeah, we should do a little session on the word Messiah, what that implies, what that means. But it's about a figure who would go into death and suffering and then come out of death and suffering, and that somehow that would release or open up something that's really good news for other people. Here, that it's about the announcement that all of the failures of humanity are forgiven, and that message will be announced to all the nations starting in Jerusalem. That's his summary.
Yeah.
I just remember for years I would sit with this and be like, man, when I try to read some part of the Old Testament, I just have a hard time seeing that.
Right.
That's not the summary I would give after my first few years of trying to read the Old Testament. So how did Jesus get there?
Yeah, how did Jesus get there?
3 steps. It's really simple. The Messiah. You guys with me? Here's Jesus' summary. The Messiah, which is one of many images in the Old Testament to describe a person whom God has selected and appointed for his purposes in the world, specifically to represent God to people and to represent people before God. The Messiah, God's chosen, favored one. You with me? That's step 1 of Jesus' summary. The Messiah enters into suffering and to death. But then out of death and through the other side, that Messiah is vindicated from suffering and death into resurrection life and into what Jesus says, forgiveness and good news announced to all of the nations. In Jesus' mind, it seems so simple. It's like, yeah, just read it. And that's what it's about. The Hebrew Bible is a lot like Blue Note era American jazz. And anybody, next slide. Yeah, there we go. Come on. Okay. So Blue Note label, anybody? Yeah, right. So this is a jazz label. It started in the late 30s, but really came into its own in the late 50s and early 60s. And when very few African-American jazz composers get signed to large music labels, Blue Note just created the most genius group of music composers, I think, in my humble opinion, in American history. John Coltrane being one of them. And what is really one of the trademarks of this era of modern jazz music was that the first 30 seconds of any song was given over to giving you the melody, just the core melody. And sometimes it would be just 30 seconds, sometimes 20 seconds. And then the rest of the song would just be cycling through the core melody. But never identically and never the same. Every time you walk through the melody, you explore it from another angle. You explore it with another instrument. And so this is one of John Coltrane's most famous albums and his famous song, Blue Train. Anybody? I mean, if you heard it, you would know. The melody is very simple. Da-da-da-da-da-da, da-da-da-da-da-da, da-da-da-da-da. Da-da-da-da-da, da-da-da-da-da, da-da-da-da-da. There it is. All right. The song is 11 minutes long. It's 11 minutes long. And it's that. But never like how I just sung it to you, right? Actually good. But you actually never fully hear the first statement identically ever again. It's just cycled and recycled, this time with the piano, this time with the bass, this time with the major chords turned minor, this time in harmony, this time at double tempo. And it's just and what this form of music is, it's a way of exploring just a few notes in one melody, but exploring the infinite potential that's possible when you look at those set of notes from all the possible angles. The Hebrew Bible is just like this. And so when the hostile one steps onto the scene, like, you know this character, you've actually encountered this character dozens of times before, and you know what he's going to say, and you know what he's all about. It's meant to be understood in light of what the entirety of the Hebrew Bible is about. And you've already been prepared if you've been tracing the melody. So here is my best attempt to show you the melody, and then we'll come back to it.
Well, it begins by introducing us to a beautiful mind, the author of all reality, a being called God. And he has the power to take the dark chaos of the uncreated world and bring about order and beauty and a garden full of life.
And to crown this accomplishment, God appoints these creatures called humanity,
or in Hebrew, Adam.
And they're made as God's image.
Which means that they're commissioned to rule this beautiful world on God's behalf by harnessing all of its potential and creating even more beauty and order.
This is a story about humans using their power to do meaningful, life-giving work. But the question is, how?
Yeah, humanity now faces a choice that's represented by a fruit tree. So humans could partner with God and find freedom by trusting in his knowledge of good and evil.
Or
they could seize power and define good and evil on their own, which, God warns, will kill them.
And they hear the voice of a dark, mysterious creature that tells them the choice is simple. Take the fruit. It'll give you power and freedom to rule the world on your own terms.
And so they seize this knowledge, and as a result, they become suspicious and self-protective. It leads to fractured relationships, violent power grabs, and ultimately, a whole civilization, Babylon, that has redefined evil as good. And so, God scatters this corrupted human project.
And here the story of the Bible takes an important turn. We zoom into the story of a man and a woman who come out of Babylon, Abraham and Sarah.
Yeah, God promises that from them will come a new people, a nation that has another chance to make the right choice. And if they succeed, it will open up this new way forward for the rest of humanity.
And this is why the rest of the Bible story is about this family.
And it does not go well. Despite God's personal guidance, Abraham's family gives in to that same temptation to redefine good and evil on their own terms, apart from God.
Even when their best people were in charge, rulers who loved God's guidance and had divine wisdom, even they gave in.
And so Israel was warned by their own prophets that these choices would lead them back to Babylon, this time as conquered captives living in exile, and that's exactly what happened.
So even with God's personal guidance, Israel fails? Who can succeed?
Well, the prophet said that the story wasn't over. God's going to send a new leader to Israel to cover for their failures and to transform the people's hearts and minds so that they can make the right choice.
And so the part of the Bible called the Old Testament ends, and these promises are left hanging.
And then the biblical story continues into the New Testament.
Only just joined us. My central thesis throughout all of this is that the best way we can understand what Paul was on about throughout his writings is to see him as a Jewish thinker whose Jewish thought has been turned upside down and inside out, in and through and around and by Jesus, the crucified and risen Messiah, and the Holy Spirit who has been poured out. My basic argument, as with monotheism, and indeed dovetailing with it at every point, is that Paul doesn't see God's answer to the plight of the world as a totally radical new action without a backstory. Musical illustration. You have a concerto, and the soloist finally enters in the concerto, on the piano or the violin or whatever. Something radically new is happening, but we realize, and only then perhaps do we realize, what the earlier music that the orchestra was playing had been all about. Without the soloist, it's not going to mean anything, but the soloist actually is playing the solo in relation to that earlier music. You can't push that illustration too far, but it shows you the kind of thing I mean. There's a subtle process of mutual interpretation going on between the ultimate revelation of God's solution, Jesus and the Spirit, and the long previous years of promise and pain and puzzlement. The Messiah died for our sins and was raised in accordance with the Scriptures, says Paul. And that doesn't mean, I can find a few proof texts here and there if you give me a few minutes to hunt through my scrolls. He means that there is, after all, a single continuous narrative, stretching back all the way to Abraham and indeed ultimately to Adam, in which the appearance of the Messiah and the gift of the Spirit are the long-awaited climax and fulfillment. You see, Paul is recapitulating and developing and drawing to a climax the ancient Jewish tradition of telling the story of Israel. It's going on throughout the Old Testament. The radical new thing which God had done in Jesus is the thing which he promised Abraham he would do in the first place. That story is told in dozens of ways in different Jewish texts. And Paul's various tellings of this story, in bits and sometimes as a whole, belong on this map. Although, as with many of those Jewish tellings, he has allowed the new thing that's occurred to shape the way he then tells the backstory. It isn't just that he's got the whole backstory and then plonks Jesus on top of it. No, because of Jesus, he now sees for the first time really how to tell that story.
It's what it's about. Jesus is saying the Hebrew Bible is about is actually what it's about. Like every story, every book, it's about an anointed representative going into death on behalf of others, coming out to life so that new life and forgiveness can be announced to the world.
Yeah.
That's what it's about.
Yeah.
It's not about something else. And so but
it's about that in order for all humanity to be God's image.
Yes, that's right.
Yeah.
Because in a way, all humanity is called to be the anointed representative. That is the image of God. I think for me, there's just, in terms of our beginning point, what is the Bible about? And therefore, what do you do with it? It's a story. It's a unified story about God's purposes for humanity that all come focused in on one anointed representative who goes into death, out the other side, so that life and forgiveness and new creation.
Which is then what we're all supposed to do as well.
Totally. It becomes the model for me.
Yes.
So in that, it's about me precisely in it being about the Messiah. The Bible is a unified collection of literature that is about the Messiah, or in our parlance, it's a unified story that leads to Jesus. That's a big part of what's underneath that shorthand statement. And by its being about the Messiah, who I believe is Jesus, it is also about us. That is how it's about us by being about the Messiah.
And so this summary right here, it's actually the life of Jesus. Just think through the story of Jesus with me. All four of the Gospels present Jesus to us as God's chosen, favored, anointed one, his righteous and blameless one. At Jesus' baptism, Jesus is marked as God's blameless, chosen Messiah. And notice Jesus gets angry a number of times in the gospel accounts about him. And at every moment, like when a man with skin disease comes up to him, this is in Mark's account of Jesus meeting the leper, and Mark tells us that Jesus got really angry. Like, who's he angry at? I'm really certain it's not God. Really certain it's not God. How did Jesus reach a place where he could see people suffering in a way that was so unjust and so tragic, and he did not question the character of God? Do you know who it made it angry at? It made him angry at that snake. Jesus described his healing ministry as breaking into the house of a highway bandit that had robbed all of this plunder from people, and he's here to get back what belongs to God. Are you with me? When Jesus saw that woman, this is in the Gospel of Luke, and her back was malformed and she had been bent over for 18 years, and what he said is, man, this woman has been enslaved to the snake for 18 years. It ends today. When Jesus saw his suffering world, the one that he was angry at was that hostile one who's responsible. And all of the roads of cause and effect of human evil and suffering within the biblical story all lead back to the moment that humans believed the lie. And we've been believing the lie ever since. And that's the one that Jesus is angry at. And God, in his mysterious purpose and mercy, has raised up a righteous servant who will go into suffering and emerge victorious out the other side. And that's exactly the story of Jesus. That's the story that Jesus saw himself fulfilling. And so the story of Jesus, the Hebrew Bible, the book of Job, it doesn't give us an answer to the things that we wish the Bible would speak to, which is why. But what it does tell us is what God is doing about human suffering.
Now for a clearer and perhaps sharper point. You'll have noticed that when I quote Paul, I regularly talk about Jesus as Messiah, not Christ. When Paul calls Jesus Christos in Greek, he knows that this is the regular Greek word for Messiah. And the way he uses that word, I believe, indicates that he wants that meaning to be heard and that he wants it to have a specific focus, namely that the Messiah is the one in and through whom the divine purpose for Israel is at last realized. Most exegetes and Pauline theologians have either ignored or marginalized any sense of Jesus' messiahship in Paul. It seemed to them, oh, that's a Jewish political title, which has all the wrong overtones, bears no relation to Paul's sense of what Jesus is all about. So they've said, well, by Paul's time, it's obviously become basically a proper name. Oh, it may carry a few messianic overtones here and there, but normally he's just using it as a name. That would be very odd if that's so, because actually we can track messianic meanings of Christos in early Christianity right through to Ignatius of Antioch. It doesn't become a proper name elsewhere. But for Paul particularly, the Messiah represents Israel, so that what is true of Israel is true of him and vice versa. To put it more sharply, it is in the Messiah and his fate that Paul sees at last what was always true of Israel as the people of God. This sense of incorporation is at the heart of Paul's language about in Christ and so on, which again people have worried about. I think this is the clue to it. Now, of course, we don't have Second Temple Jewish evidence that people thought of the Messiah as, in some sense, an incorporative figure. So that does create a historical problem. There are hints of that in the Old Testament here and there, particularly in the figure of the servant in Isaiah, who both is Israel and stands over against Israel. There's an odd to and fro there. And since Paul draws on Isaiah 40 to 55, that may well be significant. But I'm now inclined to think that Paul's train of thought here, seeing the Messiah as Israel's representative, stems basically from Jesus' resurrection. Look at it like this. Saul of Tarsus, the Pharisee, had expected that at the end of the age, God would raise all his people from the dead. Instead, what he's come to realize is that God has raised one person from the dead in the middle of history. completely unprecedented and unexpectedly. What does Paul conclude from that? That what God was going to do for all Israel at the end, he's done for Jesus in the middle. And since Jesus was put to death as a messianic pretender, if God has raised him from the dead, maybe he is Israel's Messiah. And maybe the destiny of Israel has been brought forward into the middle of history in and through and around him. It seems to me that Paul's language about Christos means what it means because he is the one who sums up his people in himself. I believe that explains passage after passage in Paul, sheds light in different directions. The redefinition of election can then be seen to great advantage in Romans chapters 2 and 3. I don't know if you've got a Bible with you, but maybe like Paul, you've already got it in your head, so that'll be all right. Here we face a problem about the strong exegetical tradition. It is widely thought, many of you will have led Bible studies on Romans, many of you will have preached on it, some of you may even have read or even written commentaries on it. It's widely thought that Romans chapters 1:18 to 3:20 is simply saying all people are sinful, Jew and Gentile alike. And it's certainly true that that is the overall point that Paul is making. But then, and I've come to regard this passage as a highly significant turn in the argument. In chapter 2, verse 17, he turns to the Jew explicitly. If you call yourself a Jew, boast in God and prove and know his will because you've studied the law. And if you're sure that you're a guide to the blind, a light to those in darkness, a corrector of the foolish, a teacher of children, having in the law the embodiment of knowledge and truth, well then, if you're teaching others, isn't it time you took the lesson yourself? You who say you shouldn't steal, do you steal? And so on and so on. Now this is normally read as Paul saying, well, you are a Jew, you think because you've got the law, you are exempt from sin. Well, I'll show you you're not. And then that runs into puzzles because, in fact, there were lots of Jews who didn't steal, commit adultery, rob temples, and so on. But that's not the point. The passage is explicitly about Israel's vocation to be the light of the world. See, Paul is echoing and endorsing the well-known and biblically warranted view of Israel's vocation, which says not that Israel is a people without sin, but that Israel is the answer to the problem. God called Abraham to undo the sin of Adam. Well, here we are. We call ourselves Jews. We're the teachers of the foolish. We're the light to the darkness, and so on. The point is not, you think you're a sinner and I'll show you that you think you're not a sinner and I'll show you are after all. The point is rather, you think you're the solution to the problem of human sin. And I will show you from your own scriptures that it hasn't worked out like that and that it can't work out like that. The scriptures themselves, including Isaiah 52, which comes not long after the passage about Israel being a light to the nations, indicate that the name of God is being blasphemed among the nations because of you. And then in verses 25 to 29 of chapter 2, Paul hints strongly, if obliquely, that there might after all be a renewed people, a people to whom the word Jew might actually be applied. A new covenant people, we might say, but that's a hint that he doesn't yet develop. What he does instead, this is vital for the whole understanding. And you know, people, I don't know how many of you know Romans this well, but if you've ever studied Romans, I bet you've found chapter 3, verses 1 to 9 really tough going. They're very dense, odd, jerky little questions. What about this? What about that? And many exegetes just kind of skip over them, really, to get to 3, 19, and 20 so that you can get into justification. But actually, what he does then is to say, well, so what's the point of being a Jew? What's the point of being circumcised? That's the question to which many Christians have given and would give the answer, none whatever. It was a failed first attempt on God's part to do something, and God has now swept that aside and given us Jesus instead. Paul would be horrified. This is where we come up against Paul's central belief, the flowering of his Jewish monotheism. God is faithful. God said he would save the world through Abraham's family, and that's what he will do. Let God be true, though every human be false. But how? Chapter 3, verses 2 and 3. The Jews were, he says, entrusted with the oracles of God. In other words, if I entrust you with a letter, the letter is not for you, the letter is for the person you're supposed to take it to. The Jews were entrusted, epistuthesan, with the oracles of God. That means they were indeed the people who were supposed to bear God's good news to the nations. But they have been faithless. Not that they haven't believed, that may be true as well. They've been unfaithful to their commission. They haven't done the job. I'll tell you, for me, the most moving moment of the Lambeth Conference in 2008, Jonathan Sacks, the chief rabbi of the United Kingdom, was invited by Rowan Williams to lecture us on covenant. It was an amazing lecture. And he then took question and answer from a group a bit bigger than this one, maybe 2,000, with Rowan Williams sitting on the platform, fielding the questions and passing them on. It was quite a sight. One of the questions was, how do you see the Christian mission to the world? Typical rabbi, he answered a question with a question. He said, how many Jews are there in China? Of course, nobody had the slightest idea. He said, at the last count, there were 7 Jews in China. He said, when I heard that, I knew 2 things. First, there'll be 8 synagogues. And said, and second, pretty soon somebody will be saying they're running the country. Then he said, how many Christians are there in China? And I forget what the answer was in 2008. It'll be even more now. It's millions. And then he said, you have done what we were meant to do. He said, I can hardly believe I'm saying this. I sat there with 2,000 people. We heard him say this. He said, you have taken the news of this covenant God to the ends of the earth. I thought, there's a man. There's a humble, wise, noble rabbi. Bless him.
God's response was a person. God's love become human, to become the righteous intercessor that you and I all could be, but we just perpetually fail to be. And Lord, have mercy upon us. And he has, that he has sent the one righteous intercessor who is the greater than Noah, the greater than Abraham, and the greater than Job. Trusting that the suffering and the victory of Jesus over death is the solution to the riddle in ways that I can't possibly comprehend. And it's not, and I'll close with this, it's not a kind of solution that you can just like walk away from. Like, we're a community of apprentices to Jesus. And what that means, at least I think what it means, is that this melody, Jesus was the crescendo of all the notes of the melody, but the song didn't stop with him. Like it's still going. And so what it means to be a Christian, that is a Messiah person, is to allow my life to become another cycle of the melody. Not because I think I can save the world, but because I'm pretty sure I'm connected to the one who did. And the only way I know how to allow him to save me is to take on the melody in my own life story. And so all of a sudden, the book of Job can become like our coach and our mentor for what it's going to mean for each one of us to stare into the suffering that is certain for each one of us. And if it hasn't crashed into your life yet, it will. And who are you going to be angry at? And I want to be angry at the right person, if you could even call the hostile one a person. Do what the whole of the Hebrew Bible is designed to do, which is not to give us an answer, an intellectual answer that we can tuck in our pockets and walk away feeling good about the world, because we shouldn't be feeling good about the world. We live outside of Eden, you guys. It sucks out here. We're dying. You're dying. Do you know that? I'm dying. It's terrible, actually. It's not okay what happens out here. And, all the ways that we anesthetize ourselves, with our devices and creature comforts, the world's not okay. But man, what if here outside of Eden, we had somebody who would stare down the worst of human pain and suffering and maintain their integrity and surrender their lives before God? Man, what if someone like that came along? And every cycle of the melody just keeps focusing in on one solution. Man, if we just had one human who actually didn't listen to the snake, who actually didn't give in to the desires and the creature comforts that get us all to compromise and redefine good and evil by our own wisdom and in our own eyes. Man, what if someone like that came along? And it's like the Hebrew Bible gives you the silhouette, and Jesus of Nazareth just walks right into it. That's what he's saying.
The New Testament begins. It introduces us to Jesus of Nazareth, not as some random guy, but as someone who comes to fulfill these specific ancient promises.
Yeah, we learn that he's from the line of David, Judah, and Abraham.
And he goes around Israel announcing that the goodness of God's kingdom is here now. And he begins confronting the effects of evil on people by healing them, by forgiving them of their sins and evil.
Many people are now believing that this is, in fact, the promised king.
But Jesus began telling his closest followers that he was going to become king and bring peace by taking the full effect of humanity's evil into himself.
The fatal snakebite wound.
Exactly. And so it seems like the serpent wins. And this story actually would be a tragedy except for what happens next.
So how will God do what he's promised? How will he save the world? Through Israel. Paul leaves the question hanging, but not for long. First, he will complete the framing argument in 3:10-20. All the human race are guilty. That's the way it is. But then, the very text Paul uses to ram this point home, Psalm 143, provides the clue to the answer. In your sight, he quotes, shall no one living be justified? Yes, but the psalmist, immediately at the same point, calls on God, deliver me in your righteousness. From many texts, we ought to know what this means. Footnote, sorry, if you've got the New International Version, you will never understand Romans 3. That's just the way it is. Ask me about that afterwards if you want. I'm serious. God's righteousness, the dikaiosune theou, is his faithfulness to the covenant through which he had promised to redeem Israel and so to rescue creation from its Adamic entail. And that is what God has now done. The problem was universal human sin, but then the second order problem that God had promised to save the world through Israel, and Israel had let him down. What is now required is for God to reveal his covenant faithfulness in action through a faithful Israelite. And Paul declares in Romans 3:21 and 22 that that's precisely what God has done. But now, God's own righteousness, his covenant faithfulness, has been unveiled. It's that curtain being torn back again thing. God's righteousness has been unveiled apart from the Torah, though the Torah and the prophets bear witness to it, the righteousness of God, the covenant faithfulness of God, through the faithfulness of the Messiah, for the benefit of all who have faith. I know that's a different translation to what some people have, and the phrase pistis Christou is much controverted, but that argument from Romans 3:1, 2, and 3 through to 3:21 and 22 means, I think this is absolutely certain, the argument requires a faithful Israelite. What we've got is the faithful Messiah. He has done what Israel was supposed to do and didn't do. Now we see that this Jesus, the Messiah, is also the living and dying embodiment of Israel itself, the people of God. He sums them up in himself and does for them in the world what nobody else could do.
Jesus rises from the dead.
And now Jesus has the power over evil and death for himself.
And so the rest of the New Testament is then making this claim that Jesus' power over evil and death has now become available to us to begin confronting the effects of evil in our lives.
But even still, death and evil are a real problem in our world all around us.
And so the story of the Bible ends by describing this future day when Jesus comes back and he finishes the job. He destroys the snake once and for all, and he restores the goodness of the garden here on earth.
And so for a long time, when I was introduced to what the story of Christianity and the Bible is all about, it was a way of telling the story of the Bible that went like this. Everything was created to be perfect. Humans give in to sin and death, and make it all bad and terrible. And through Jesus, everything is going to be perfect again one day. You guys tracking with me? It's a very common way of retelling the story. The problem with that retelling of the story is the Bible. Because that's not how the story begins. It doesn't begin perfect. It begins with darkness and disorder and chaos. And out of that state of chaos, God doesn't make something that's perfect. He makes something that is 7 times over called, in Genesis 1, it's called good. And I'm pretty sure good doesn't mean perfect. Good means good, yeah? But perfect means complete. And so the way the biblical authors tell the story is God brought order and goodness out of chaos. But then when he puts the human in the garden, in proximity to his own life, what that is an opportunity for good to become complete. And that is an opportunity that is forfeited and never realized in the biblical story, because they make the dumb choice, and they go where? They go out into the wilderness, and then it ends up in a flood again. Are you with me? So in other words, the resolution to the biblical story, Jesus comes onto the scene not to restore a perfection that was lost, but it's actually to reclaim a future and a destiny that has never been experienced by any human before. Are you tracking with me? And so, what I'm talking about is the overall, how we imagine the story that we're living in. So I think within Jesus' imagination, when he encounters suffering and pain, it's not, well, we live in a world that fell from perfection and God's trapped us here where we're all suffering. And man, if he was just nicer to us, he would let us at least, give us some air and give us some, right? I mean, this story tends toward a portrait of God, that he kicked us out of the good place and he's keeping us down here and we're suffering. And if he was nicer to us, he might give us some relief. And that's not how the biblical story works. The biblical story works is that we live in a good world, but man, it is not complete. And the problem is that we keep, through our own folly and believing the lies of that snake, keep giving ourselves and our communities and creation over to chaos and disorder. Are you tracking with me? And so the death and the suffering that's in our world within that frame of the biblical story is exactly what it's the natural course of all creation. If God doesn't create, it's just the way things are, desolate and wilderness. Within that way of telling the biblical story, which I think is actually the way it's trying to present itself to us, suffering and death is about God's good creation being dragged back into a state of disorder and chaos. And what Jesus is doing is rescuing people from the chaos and opening up a way to the reunion of heaven and earth and to completion once again. And it's just another way that helps us begin to imagine evil and suffering within a different kind of story.
Go back and think about when I was first introduced to the Bible. It would have been so helpful if I was introduced to the Bible. At least somebody's saying, you want to know what it's about? It's about this. And somehow it's just taken me a much longer, more complicated journey to come to a place of clarity about what it's about. It's sort of like hidden in plain sight if you read one of the Gospels. It's what Jesus says it's about.
Yeah.
But I read the statement in Luke while also taking classes at a Bible college, and it wasn't clear from many of those classes that this is what the Bible's about.
Yeah.
That's weird when I step back and reflect on that.
Mm-hmm.
So anyway, I guess that's why we're doing what we're doing.
We've got so much to celebrate, and we're just getting started. Please take a second to subscribe. It means so much to this channel. Thank you guys for watching the content. We've got so much left to share in this series. Stay tuned. The beginning is near.
And so my hope for all of us is that we can become a community that learns how to lament and how to model our righteous intercession based on the righteous intercession of the ultimate righteous servant of God. May God have mercy on us.